Gross Domestic Product, Chapter 5. In Chapter 5, we'll cover the circular flow of income and expenditure, and eventually see that income is equal to expenditure because income is created from product. We'll go on to define GDP, and afterwards, from our diagrams of the economy, we'll show the application of the theorized economy. Lastly, we'll review GDP for China and Japan and barely touch on relationships that GDP has to another indicator such as unemployment. First off, what is GDP? The easiest way to begin thinking about GDP is to think about money. We're going to introduce a simple economy where there are only households and businesses, then build on the diagram to introduce savings, and then add the government and the foreign sector. We'll see how the easiest way to think of GDP is money, because we'll see GDP is equal to expenditure, which is equal to income. Note that expenditure means to spend or use up. As we said, we'll start off with a simple imaginary economy, and we'll have household and businesses. So right now you live in your home, and you most likely have a job. So you get a paycheck every 2 weeks. And we'll write that, and we'll show that paycheck in our imaginary economy as income. The amount of income being produced in our economy is $1 million. In this simple imaginary economy, households consume all of their money. Therefore, consumption is going to equal to our 1 million. We stated in the beginning, Y is equal to E. In this case, income is equal to 1 million, and expenditures is equal to 1 million. We can see that this holds true. What happens when we add savings into the economy? Well, as we start off, you're still going to work, and that is giving you income. The whole economy is still making 1 million, but this time around, they're only consuming $800,000. Recall that expenditures is the using up of income. So as of now, how much money have we used up? Well, we've only used up 800,000. What happens to the other 200,000? Well, that's where banks come in. You're putting your hard-earned money in the bank for a total of 200,000. Now here's the question. Is that 200,000 being used up? It's not. It's leaking out of the economy. So how do you think that money is being used up? Well, the banks loan that money out to the businesses in the form of investments, which is going to equal the 200,000. Now, if you're keen, you'll ask, how is that 200,000 that the business is taking out a loan considered GDP? Isn't it supposed to be an expenditure, meaning that it's being used up? Well, if you thought that, you're right. And if you're asking, how is that investment included into GDP? Well, GDP's investment includes inventory investment and fixed investment. Inventory means more widgets, more items, and that'll be on the shelves. A fixed investment is like a machine that is used to produce something. So let's say that this $200,000 that's being invested is used to buy 3 new machines. Those 3 new machines do count as expenditure since they're being used up as fixed investment. Remember that Y is equal to E, and now we're going to build on what E equals. E equals C plus I plus G plus NX. Well, first off, we said that we're consuming 800,000. 200,000 leaked out of the economy, but it was placed back in when the business took out the loan for 200,000. This totaled are 1 million as expenditure. And so we see here y, which is here, equals 1 million, which is equal to expenditure. And now we'll move on to government and foreign sector. Just like we had before, we're going to have household and businesses. Again, we'll start off with income. And this time, it's going to equal to 1,100,000. Recall that income is equal to expenditure, and that expenditure is equal to C plus I plus G plus NX. Of the 1.1 million of income, our households are consuming or using up 800,000. And so in this case, households are saving 300,000. Well, remember, what is another form of expenditure? That was private investments. The bank is going to loan the business $200,000, and that money is being used up in things like fixed investment and inventory investment. But we still have 100,000 that's not being used up. Let's add up what we have first. We know that we've consumed or used up 800,000. 200,000 went to investments, which is a part of expenditure, and this will equal 1 million. But we're still missing 100,000. Let's introduce the government. The government is going to take that last 100,000 and it's going to fund it as a promise to pay back, which is known as the government deficit, which will equal 100,000. But it's not being used up yet because it hasn't been allocated to wages. In this case, the government is going to purchase goods from the private sector. So how much is it going to purchase from the private sector? You're right if you said 100,000. And this is our government expenditure, buying goods and services from business. So when we add up the last 100,000, we see that consumption plus investment plus government expenditure equals our 1,100,000. Our income, we started off with 1,100,000. And we see here that these two are equal. Now you may be thinking the government does more than just buy goods and services from businesses. You're right, they also collect taxes from people. And we'll say that that's 100,000. But since that 100,000 is going right back to households in the form of transfer payments, those two cancel out. Lastly, we said we had net export. So we're exporting 100,000 and we're importing 100,000, which is to the foreign sector. The takeaway from all of this is that income does equal expenditure, and the components of expenditure are consumption, investment, government expenditure, and net export. Application of the economy diagram. You'll most likely make your way through your city and pass by businesses and households. With your understanding of the theorized economy, you will look upon the businesses as income producing and households as product consuming. When at the bank, whether withdrawing or depositing money, you can understand that the pool of funds can be loaned out to businesses for investments. Now let's look into the definition of GDP. There are 3 criteria that must be met in order for it to be included in GDP. It must be currently produced, sold on the market, but not resold. The best example of meeting the criteria of GDP, if you go to a Mexican food store, you may see a tortilla machine making fresh tortillas which are made right in front of you. They're currently produced. A worker stands by the end to collect them, and another places them in tortilla bags, where they're then placed on shelves. The consumer comes along and purchases their freshly made tortillas. It's not very likely that they'll be resold meeting the three criteria of GDP. Now let's look at another example, but instead of mass producing tortillas, they'll be cars, no pun intended. Again, the GDP criteria are currently produced, sold on the market, but not resold. Let's say these Honda CR-Vs are being manufactured in 2017 and are being sold in the same year at Honda dealerships. The cars, as we see in the picture, are currently produced, sold on the market, the Honda dealerships, and these new cars aren't being resold. They too meet the criteria of GDP. What else can you think about that meets the criteria of being included in GDP? How about something as simple as the shirt you're wearing? You're at H&M and browsing the shirts and find a blue one that fits your style. The shirt on the rack was produced the same year you bought it, so it was currently produced. You're at the store, so it's sold on the market, and you're not going to resell it because you really like it. Now there are two components that we must look at for GDP, called intermediate good and final good, and the importance is to learn to not double count. Example 1. Coffee beans are needed to make a cup of coffee. A farmer sells them to the coffee shops, and the coffee shop then sells them to you, the consumer, as a final good. Is there an intermediate good? A good in the middle? Yes, the coffee beans. Let's say the coffee beans cost $1, but you bought the coffee for $4.50. What is the value added by the farmer? You're right if you said $1, the cost that the farmer sold the beans to the shop. What's the added value by the coffee shop? It's $3.50. The total value added for the coffee was $4.50, which is equal to final good. The end product is what's included in GDP. Example 2. Now let's take a look at a muffin made by a baker. The muffin has wheat in it, which the baker buys from a local farmer. The farmer's value added to the whole muffin, or price for the ingredient wheat, was 50 cents. The baker adds $1 to the total value of the muffin, which is being sold for $1.50. The total value is $1.50, which is equal to the final good included in GDP. To avoid double counting, we count the final product sold on the market to not report $1.50 for the muffin and 50 cents for the wheat, which would be $2. We can see in the $1.50 the price includes the cost of the wheat. Application. When you shop at a Vons or Walmart, you'll notice the product on the shelves are final goods, with the prices already taking account of wages, overhead, and profit margin. Now let's take a look at China and Japan's GDP. We'll start off with the GDP of China. I'll click here where it says GDP. And now we have a graph of GDP. We can see a trend from 1960 to all the way about 2014 that GDP is increasing, as shown. But GDP alone isn't significant for when you're writing your paper. It's important to make a connection. So you can say something like GDP is increasing from the time period here 1960 to 2014, which means that employment in China was increasing. But remember not to judge an economy solely on GDP, because it does not include the standard of living. We know that in China that there are many people. Another indicator to consider is GDP per capita, which it means GDP per person. We know that the GDP for China is very high, but they also have a very high population. Is it number one in the world? If it is, this GDP per person is going to be lower and lower with the number of people there. But you can compare that to another economy, such as Japan, who also has a very strong GDP, but with fewer people. You'd have to check the numbers, but you could say that the standard of living in Japan is better than the standard of living in China because their GDP per person is higher. Now, don't think that just because the GDP per person is high, the economy is doing well. Because if we have 100 poor people and one really rich person, let's say that this is Bill Gates and we'll add another rich person, Warren Buffett, and we'll say that these poor people here are all from Detroit. Well, that's 102 people. The total income would be massive because of Buffett and Gates, but it would be distributed only over 102 people. You can bet that the GDP per person would be very, very high. So that's another thing to consider when thinking about GDP per person. Now let's jump on over to Japan. Japan's GDP click on it. We also see here it's about the same thing from 1960 to 2014. GDP has been increasing, which means that employment has been increasing. When GDP increases, there's more expenditures, and when employment is going up, there's more income being created. Now remember, GDP per person. Japan's economy is very strong. Their GDP is going to be the third strongest. Let's check if it's the third strongest. Yeah, it's the third strongest. They don't have as much people as Japan, so their GDP per person is going to be better versus China. So remember that when you're writing your paper, you can say something like GDP in Japan has been increasing in the last decade, which means that the rate of employment is also increasing because they share a direct relation. GDP consists of consumption, investment, government expenditures, and net exports. During the last 5 years, the government decided to increase government spending due to Prime Minister Ch5, who wanted better infrastructure. This has led to many job opportunities for the Japanese, who with the extra income consume products from the economy. Businesses see the demand and want to increase inventory, so they have taken out more private investment, shown by The Economist. So something like this will help you, your economics professor. Your intro economic professor wants to see that you're reasoning, and it's good that you know that as GDP increases, the rate of employment also increases, but it's a lot better if you go in depth and show how exactly that increase in GDP is translating. It's very good to have sources such as reports from the New York Times or the Los Angeles if you're in the US, and it outlines what policies the government is going to take or has taken. And because it has taken it, you can back it up with data. You can insert a nice graph. You insert a nice graph and you'll show the trends and how the policy is being affected. And one thing one of my professors always showed me is try to it's better to have a graph, because you can say what you need to say in a paragraph and sum it all up in a graph. So a graph's a powerful tool.